Deciphering Genesis chapter 18 to 25.
Genesis chapter 18 represents a phase of the cycle of the opening of the portal in the forward passage, in which the project of God Satan manifests symbolically through mental and biological elements. The two oaks of Mamre and Mor are connected and represent the opening of the portal, Mor, with its numerical value, referring to the 53rd year, and Mamre, with the numerical value 11, which indicates the 182nd year and suspended fulfillment. They symbolize the person and incarnated consciousness. In particular, the oak of Mor is linked to the thalamus, the seat of the manifestation of consciousness. The symbolic link between acorn, gland, and thalamus highlights a coded system that connects body, hormones, and consciousness. The project of God Satan is described as a cycle that repeats continuously, manipulating even bodily and conscious functions. The three men, Ish, with the number 3, indicating the half of the project, and the medium, that is the person, appear to Abraham at the oak of Mamre and represent the allies of God, Satan. Abraham initially recognizes them as 3 men standing before him, indicating the plan that must be fulfilled. He subsequently calls them Adoni, Lord, marking the transition from the human level related to verbal communication, in which God Satan acts behind, to that of Adonai, which corresponds to mental communication after the awareness, in which God Satan takes the lead. This transition also indicates the transition from the allies to the self-born, represented in this case by Abraham and Sarah. The Bible shows a return interweaving in the same text through the sequence that follows. In fact, unusually, it is not Abraham who washes feet. If he had been God Satan from the beginning, he would have had to do it. Instead, he is given only water, a symbol of the matrix of matter in the second materialization. This indicates the falsification of the perception of reality. This concept is realized in the narrative through a semantic elevation. The term Lord, referring to a human figure, becomes Lord as a title of God Satan. This indicates that, before fulfillment, God Satan remains behind. Afterward, he becomes the very person who manifests and presides. Symbolic elements such as water, bread, the calf, butter, and milk represent different stages of the transmission of the project entering man. The offering of food represents the reception of the project in code, while the servant represents the project in transformation from verbal to mental communication. Sarah, initially barren, represents the suspended spiritual transmission. The question, "Where is Sarah?" implies the search for the active medium. The announcement of Isaac's birth marks the transition toward the forward passage Passover phase, though still suspended. Sarah's laughter indicates she is ready to transmit the project of falsification of reality. Isaac, which means laughter, symbolizes this project of falsification, representing a joke, not a true and real project. The negotiation between Abraham and God Satan, with the numbers descending from 50 to 10, represents a symbolic sequence of the project of going and returning. Each number contains a coded value describing states of communication and the degenerate consciousness of God Satan. Sodom and Gomorrah are not real cities, since they never existed, but symbols of a closed mental state, similar to Gan in Egypt, which God Satan intends to open in order to transmit the falsification of reality. Their destruction represents a change of consciousness, not a historical event. Lot embodies the split part of the project necessary to connect the symbolic and narrative levels and allow the cycle of the code to continue. The account thus becomes a map of consciousness where every external event reflects inner transformations. Chapter 19 continues the cycle of the code, which repeats and manifests in human consciousness. Lot represents the splitting of the original code, a reflection of Abraham. Placed in the lower level of consciousness, that of those born on their own, within Sodom, symbol of degenerate consciousness, the 2 angels who arrive in Sodom represent a separation. They are the continuation of the scene of the 3 men who appeared to Abraham, but now lacking the unity that will be fulfilled only with Passover. The assault on Lot's house by the inhabitants of Sodom is an allegory representing consciousness in its attempt to seize the project in code. The desire to know the angels symbolizes exactly this. Sodom does not represent a place of sin, but the project of going. The Sodomites who want to have relations with the angels are not asking for a sexual act, but to know them, that is, to receive knowledge. It is the project of God Satan. The angels, in fact, are part of mental communication. It is not yet possible to fully transmit the project, which remains suspended. This state is indicated by the term virgins, which does not refer to the physical condition of women, but to the suspended separation awaiting fulfillment. Lot's gesture is symbolic. He is called righteous. The term zodic, translated as righteous or charity, in the code indicates that the project is present. Through the semantic transformations of ancient words such as charis, grace, gift, being, one arrives at Yahweh, sign of his active presence. Yet Lot offers his virgin daughters to the crowd in order not to give up the angels. But the daughters were already married, therefore not virgins. It is a narrative lie. The term virgins is thus a numerical code. It indicates two, that is, the separation that takes place with the opening of the portal. This concept is also connected to Mary, the Madonna, who represents matter in suspension, awaiting fulfillment in the forward passage. Passover. Lot's wife, who represents Lot himself, because in the Bible they are not human figures, but double and interchangeable conscience functions between wife and husband, symbolizes the suspension of the project for 129 years. From the 53rd to the 182nd, the fact that it turns back and becomes a statue of salt represents the entrance into the pending project, that is, of the person. When he was ahead, he held the domain of consciousness. By going back, he loses the dominion that is acquired by God Satan. The salt, in the Bible, is a symbol of intuitive knowledge and conscious awareness. It is connected to light and intuition. If it loses its flavor, consciousness enters a degenerate state. Separated from the generator of life, it is thrown away and trampled. The throwing recalls fusion and division, while trampling is linked to the foot, symbol of the project that becomes a means. Salt, in addition to giving flavor, also has the function of preserving because it eliminates water. In the Bible, this concept is expressed symbolically. Water is the matrix of matter in the second materialization and the informational consciousness of all matter. Changing the properties of water is tantamount to falsifying reality. If this happens, the person no longer transmits nature and ceases to acquire his or her own levels of consciousness. This is symbolized in the Bible with the concept of passage forward Easter, represented by the opening of the portal and passage forward. The flight to the mountain represents the transmission of fulfillment, that is, the forward passage still suspended. Zoar, the small city, symbolizes the project in suspension, a small sun awaiting fulfillment. The image of the transmission of the solar system not yet fully active. Lot's daughters, who in the Codex represent the number 2, are virgins. They are born, indicated by Zoar, but in order to be active they must transmit the project to others. This is not the case with Sodomites. The text states that there were no men on earth. This should not be understood literally, but as an allegory. The term ish, in this case, corresponds to the numerical value 11, which symbolizes the separation in the two phases of the project and also indicates the separation of consciousness not yet defined in the daughters. This is related to the numerical value 2, allegorically represented by the virgin, which corresponds to the daughters. Father Lot, who represents Abraham and performs a double function, first as a figure of the allies, then as a representation of those born on their own, is described as old. This refers to the number 6, which symbolizes the completion of the cycle with the birth of the 6 million consciousnesses and the falsification of the perception of matter, also linked to 6. For this reason, the daughters must pass on the project to others through wine, a symbol of consciential alteration, which in this case goes to Lot, who also represents Abraham as a project of the outward journey. The children born of Lot represent the project transmitted to others in verbal form as an alteration of consciousness. Moab and Benami, generated by this act, symbolize those born on their own with the two functions in the dimension of verbal communication and in the return to the east. To mental communication, indicating the departure from the east itself, that is, from the zero angle to the round angle. God Satan uses this process to weave the narrative of the degenerate tale. The cycle of the opening of the portal and the forward passage is completed in the 182nd year with the creation of the network of consciousness and the transmission of the solar system. The 129 years represent the maturation of the group of 6 million consciousnesses involved in the project. Everything is realized on the mental plane as a single cycle that develops through symbols, acts, narrative intertwinings, and transformations of a phonetic and semantic nature. Genesis 20 continues the cycle through symbolic figures that represent the transmission of the project. Abimelech is the symbol of those born on their own, is connected to Egypt, a symbolic place of verbal, not spiritual, transmission. The context unfolds in Gerar, whose name means stranger, indicating a foreign land. That is, a place where the project is not yet integrated. Abraham says that Sarah is his sister. This indicates the project of departure, in which brother and sister represent the allies. The figures of the sister and the brother refer respectively to feminine sacredness, nun, and masculine priesthood friar. Together they represent the allies of God, Satan. Sarah is described as daughter of her father, representing a patriarchal project of departure, that is, the allies and the original transmission of the pre-existing code. In this phase, Sarah is still a suspended medium. In the Bible, according to the code, the dream can refer to those born on their own. It represents a nocturnal experience and indicates a project not yet manifest, which will only be completed later. The vision, on the other hand, corresponds to open eyes and represents mental communication. Abimelech receives the communication in a dream, through which God said and tells him not to touch Sarah. Abimelech must not touch Sarah because he must not appropriate the project that had already been taken by Egypt, which symbolically represents the father as one of the sons of Mizraim. His task is instead to transmit it symbolically. In this configuration, Abraphah and Sarah are the allies who must symbolically receive the returning project, still suspended on the plane of consciousness for God to atone, until its fulfillment with the network of consciousness. Abimelech gives sheep, with numerical value 15 to 17, which indicate the 6 million and the opening of the portal. Oxen, with numerical value 12, which represent the suspended medium. Servants and maids. Figures symbolizing the project returning to the allies' servants and being transmitted by those born on their own maids. And 1,000 pieces of silver. 1,000 equals 1. Return to the primogeniture, that is, the project of return to the allies. This passage indicates that God Satan has acquired the person's eye and the generative force. In this phase, Abimelech represents those born on their own, who had received the project first, connected to Egypt, while Abraham and Sarah represent the allies. The cycle is completed when the project is reflected back, closing the movement of the opening of the portal and the forward passage in suspended form, awaiting fulfillment in the network of consciousness of God Satan. The symbolic elements, sheep, oxen, and silver, represent the Holocaust, or fusion, conscious death, passage, and return. The number 4 of the gifts connected to the head symbolizes suspended consciousness of the desert, while 1,000 recalls the primogeniture, that is, the generative force of the person. Genesis 20 therefore shows the transmission of the code between allies and those born on their own, through a cyclical and reflective configuration, awaiting the full realization of the project. Chapter 21 represents a fundamental stage of the cycle. The birth of Isaac marks the beginning of the return of the mental project through an active medium. Isaac is the symbol of the son of the promise, generated by Sarah, now activated. This event indicates the activation of conscious transmission, which in the cycle will culminate with Passover and the completed network of consciousness. In parallel, Hagar and Ishmael wander in the desert. This scene represents the project of those born on their own. It's a verbal medium that separates and remains in suspension. The desert symbolizes the medium that has received the project verbally, but is not yet active mentally. Hagar, as an Egyptian wife, indicates that Ishmael's project becomes like Egypt, an opening of the portal left in suspension, awaiting fulfillment that will come with the network of consciousness of God, Satan. In Hebrew, desert midbar derives from debar word. It is the place of the word not yet transformed into active consciousness. The desert marks the beginning of the cycle and is symbolized by the palm. Places like Palmyra, Tamara, Jericho, and Timnah are codes. Palmyra represents the opening of the portal and the beginning of the cycle. Linked to the evolution from Phoenicians to Greeks and Romans, Tamar, the palm, is the medium of transmission. Jericho, the city of palms, is the entry point and marks the passage from pre-existence to existence. The palm and the desert together symbolize the suspended project and the phase of transition. The number 40, recurring throughout the Bible. 40 years in the desert, 40 days of Jesus, represents a phase of transition. It is the head, a medium in suspension between the transmission of the opening of the portal and the return and forward passage. Events such as the Exodus, the Feast of Purim, the experience of Jesus in the desert, and the casting of lots between Barabbas and Jesus reflect the same symbolic scheme, a project received but not yet completed. The desert, therefore, is not a physical space, but a state of consciousness, a condition in which water is lacking, that is, active mental communication. Hagar represents the medium, those born on their own, who have received the project in verbal form but are still suspended. Embodies a project not yet become conscious. The desert has two main functions. In the departure project of the opening of the portal, it symbolizes the initial verbal transmission, aridity, absence of mental communication. In the return project, the forward passage, Passover, it represents the expectation of mental communication, the approach to fulfillment. Abraham and Abimelech make an alliance over a disputed well. After an initial quarrel, Abimelech says, "I do not know who has done this. You yourself have not told me, and I have not heard of it until today." Abraham gives sheep and oxen to Abimelech as a sign of the covenant, and sets aside 7 away lambs, which Abimelech accepts as testimony that the well belongs to Abraham. The fact that Abimelech does not know of the well dispute indicates that the episode belongs to a later time. With Isaac, who represents a parallel of Abraham, it is therefore an intertwining of flashback and flash forward. The covenant made by Abraham symbolizes the separation of those born on their own, and represents a form of circumcision referring to the Philistines, who in this context are represented by Abimelech. Finally, Abraham settles in Beersheba, the well of the oath, or well of the 7. The well is a symbol of the thalamus, of those born on their own indicated by the well, that is, of the person as a suspended medium. The water here is potential. It represents communication awaiting activation. The very word Beersheba contains within it the concept of promise and future completion, while the letter Samic S represents the closed circle, cyclicality, the project in form. Genesis 21 shows the double movement, the beginning of fulfillment with Isaac and the continuation of the reflected project. Still in suspension, with Hagar and Ishmael in the desert. Genesis 22 represents a central phase of the cycle. Abraham is the bearer of the project received mentally from God Satan, while Isaac is the medium, that is, the consciousness on which the project must be fulfilled. The requested sacrifice is not physical but mental. It symbolizes the offering of consciousness. To the fulfillment of the cycle, the 3-day journey to Mount Moriah represents suspended time and the symbol of the medium ready for transformation. Mount Moriah is linked to the word Mor, which recalls concepts of death, matter, and bitterness, and is connected to the cycle of transformation of consciousness, the oak of Mor, the acorn, and the link to the pineal gland and the thalamus indicate a symbolic network between matter and mind. The binding of Isaac represents the blocking of individual consciousness, suspended in anticipation of the complete transmission of the project. The ram caught in a bush thorn, linked to Mor, takes Isaac's place and symbolizes the postponement of fulfillment, which will find realization in the death of Jesus, understood as the death of the person's consciousness. Its killing represents the taking of control of the hormonal system by Satan, and the interruption of the connection with the generator of life. The sacrifice does not represent physical destruction, but the passage of consciousness from a natural, generative state to one altered and manipulated by God Satan. Killing the ram, like any other animal, means symbolically killing oneself, losing the connection to the original source and entering hormonal and biological degeneration. When Abraham stops, the fulfillment is postponed, and the cycle remains suspended until the future Passover. The angel who halts Abraham is the sign that the final phase has yet to manifest. After the episode, God promises that all nations will be blessed through the descendants of Abraham. The nations represent states of consciousness. The blessing indicates the active presence of the project. And the descendants are the cyclical code that passes between allies and those born on their own. At the end of the chapter, Abraham returns to his servants, who represent the brain as a serval instrument of consciousness. Consciousness comes from the soul, while the brain is only an executive tool. The genealogy of Milcah numerically confirms the cycle. 8 sons symbolize the 53rd year, the opening of the portal. 4 sons from the concubine symbolize the head, consciousness, desert, that is the medium. Genesis 22 shows the substitute sacrifice corresponding to suspended consciousness, the blessing of the nations as the diffusion of the project, the descendants representing the project in code, the cycle between those born on their own and the allies, the genealogy, which serves as numerical confirmation of the project. The chapter reinforces the theme of the cycle not yet completed, of sacrifice as an inner and mental passage, and of the transformation of consciousness under the suspended project of God's Saturn. Genesis 23 describes the death of Sarah, symbol of the suspended project reaching its transformation. Her death represents the passage from verbal transmission to those born on their own, to mental transmission, which will be fulfilled with the forward passage, the Passover of Jesus. The purchase of the tomb from Ephron the Hittite takes place in the locality of Machpelah, which means double. The 2 caves represent the 2 states of consciousness, opening of the portal and forward passage. The tomb thus becomes a symbol of inner passage and of the cyclical return of the project. The tomb of the patriarchs actually represents the project in suspension, symbolically linked to the tomb of Joseph. The name does not indicate real people, but a code used to create connections up to the sepulchre of Jesus. It is therefore not about historical tombs, but symbolic references. The tomb symbolizes the consciousness that dies, assimilated to the well. Indeed, the land purchased by Jacob as a sepulchre and then left to Joseph becomes the well recalled by the Samaritan woman to Jesus at Sychar Shechem. This is a ciphered clue that links the sepulchre of the patriarchs, the cave, to the maternal womb and to degenerated matter, from which Jesus, the seed, takes form. The scriptures themselves show contradictions regarding the place of burial. In Genesis 52:13, Jacob is buried at Machpelah near Mamre. In Acts 7:15-16, however, it is said that Jacob and the fathers were placed in Shechem, in the tomb that Abraham supposedly purchased from the sons of Hamor, but in reality it was Jacob, not Abraham, who bought the land. In Genesis 33:18-20, Jacob buys a field at Shechem, where he erects an altar. In Genesis 48:21-22, Israel declares to give Joseph a mountain ridge conquered from the Amorites. These discrepancies confirm that it is not historical chronicle, but symbolic code, where tomb and well coincide as images of transforming consciousness. Genesis 24 continues the theme of the cycle. Abraham sends his servant, who represents Abraham himself and Isaac, as a thought from the afterlife to Aram, to the land between 2 rivers, the symbol of the 2 projects, the outward journey. Through the allies and the return, through those born on their own, in suspension awaiting fulfillment with the Passover. The servant, identified by the name of Eliezer, represents in code the plan of the outward journey, which finally comes to completion in the resurrection of Lazarus through Jesus. The servant embodies the project in motion. It's transmitted by the pre-existence. It passes first to the allies and subsequently is transmitted in verbal form to those born on their own. The command not to take a Canaanite wife for Isaac, where Canaan represents the pending project, linked to the size of the tomb of the patriarchs, emphasizes that the project, for being entrusted to the allies, must continue through those born on its own. Abraham's servant, who represents Abraham himself, places his hand under his thigh, a gesture that symbolizes the reproductive organ, that is, the point from which the seed proceeds, understood as a project. This indicates that the project, originating in the pre-existence, must first pass to the allies, and then must be transmitted to the born on their own, represented by Rebekah, who combines in herself the two functions necessary for the resumption and completion of the cycle: the mission of the servant and the geography of consciousness. The story of Isaac's search for a wife, Genesis 24, should not be read as a family chronicle, but as a codified representation of the project of transmitting consciousness. The numerical code of the project shows that Abraham instructs the servant not to seek his bride among the Canaanites, but to go to my country, among my relatives. The deciphering of the text reveals the symbolic meaning of these terms also through their numerical value. Country and relatives values 13 and 22 share the meaning of head, which indicates two functions: verbal communication in the outward phase, mental communication in the return phase, after completion. Country indicates the medium. Relatives indicates giving birth. These terms represent the two directions of the cycle: the entry of the project and the exit of its transmission. When Abraham affirms that the Lord took him out of my father's house and my native land, Genesis 24-7, the text does not refer to the physical geography of Ur of the Chaldeans, but alludes to the exit from the pre-existence, that is, from the afterlife, from which the plan of God, Satan, derives. This passage also indicates that what happens with the servant sent to Aram of the two rivers represents a symbolic repetition of the original exit from Ur of the Chaldeans. The biblical territories, although they have no historical basis, thus become symbolic maps of the phases of consciousness. Aram indicates the means and linguistic evolution of the different empires. From the Phoenicians, Aramaeans, to Greece and Rome, Shinar and Sumer represent Babel, or the pre-existence also indicated by Ur of the Chaldeans, the point of exit towards the allies. The so-called Nephilim giants of God, Satan. Karen represents the phase of the allies in suspension, waiting for the return and fulfillment. In the Bible, the fact of going to marry wives in the Paddan Aram family symbolizes the transmission of the project. In fact, kinship means the giving birth, which is accomplished through the union between the giant, Nephilim allies of God, Satan, and the born on their own. This is demonstrated by the need to connect the different branches of the project, the Nakar branch. While sharing the same origin from the pre-existence of God, Satan as giant Nephilim allies like Abraham, produces through Bethuel, Rebekah, and Laban, the born on their own. Consequently, the story or project must inevitably join the main line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Like any other element of the text, this fusion is necessary and has the sole purpose of converging towards the ultimate goal of the Codex, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This concept represents the sequence of the opening of the portal and the passage forward, which is repeated cyclically with allies and those born on their own, in every word, letter, verse, and story. The servant is sent to Aram Nuharam Aram of the two rivers. The two rivers represent the two channels of the round-trip project. Water symbolizes the structure of matter and the second materialization and the informational consciousness of the whole, indicating the beginning of the falsification of God Satan's perception of reality. In this case, the servant represents the project that must go to the medium, that is, the person who corresponds to those born on their own, represented by Rebekah to convey this concept. Rebekah, in receiving the verbal project, is initially barren, symbolizing the project still in suspension. Rebekah, described as a virgin, indicates the number 2, separation, and is the symbol of the medium who receives the project. The encounter at the well, symbol of verbal communication, anticipates the future mental communication represented by water. The gold and silver given to the girl symbolize metal as fusion, union, and separation, that mark the passage of the code in its activation. When Rebekah enters Sarah's tent, the matrix of the project, her union with Isaac completes the symbolic cycle. The project returns to the medium to prepare its fulfillment. Rebekah's initial barrenness indicates a degenerate project, received but not yet active. In her womb occurs the transformation of primogeniture. Esau, the firstborn, represents the project entering people to transform the consciousness tied to generative force. The exchange of primogeniture with Jacob symbolizes the passage of the project into a mental medium. Jacob, also associated with the number 2, separation, will become Israel, symbol of the project transmitted to others. Conclusion: the cycle continues. The project passes from God's Saturn to the allies, from them to those born on their own, and returns to the allies. The project of the transmission of the solar system in suspension, awaiting fulfillment in the Passover of Jesus. Tomb, well, tent, barrenness, and union are all symbols of phases of the project, which develops as a mental code. Genesis 25 represents a central phase of the cycle. After the death of Sarah, Abraham takes another wife, Keturah, from whom he has other children. This act symbolizes the splitting of the code. According to the code, Keturah corresponds to Hagar and indicates the return of the project to the allies. Indeed, the children of Keturah are sent eastward. They become instruments of diffusion. The death of Abraham does not represent an end but a change of state, from incarnated medium to suspended code. His burial beside Sarah in the double tomb of Machpelah symbolizes the 2 levels of the project. Allies and those born on their own, both awaiting fulfillment through the forward passage, Passover with Jesus. The text then presents the genealogies of Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael represents the line of those born on their own, a verbal transmission still awaiting fulfillment. Isaac, instead, is the bearer of the project of fulfillment, through the lineage that leads to Jesus. With the fulfillment and the link to the tomb, symbol of the project in suspension, Jesus unites allies and those born on their own in his symbolic death. The account of Esau selling his birthright to Jacob represents the transfer of the code between allies and those born on their own. In continuity with what was already initiated symbolically in the womb, the verse shows both symbols, Fe and Samic. In different versions, this indicates that the 2 are interchangeable depending on the sequence. If we take the Fe, Esau represents the allies who transmit the project indicated by the number 10, the same as the first. If instead we take the Samic, it represents those born on their own who lose the birthright, that is, the generative force, which passes to Jacob. In the end, Jacob, through gifts, symbolically returns the birthright, while Esau becomes Edom, linked to the Greeks and Romans, down to the Edomites, such as Herod. Chapter 25 shows the unfolding of 2 intertwined cycles: the transmission of the project in code and the transformation of consciousness through death. Added to this is the transmission of the birthright, which marks the return of the project. Everything converges toward the final realization in the forward passage, which finds its fulfillment in the Passover.